DFS.
It is Friday, January 20th here in Draft Shark Studios in Rochester, New York. Welcome to the Divisional Round DFS podcast. I'm your host, Matt Schaff. With me, as always, is Jared Smola. Jared, this one snuck up on me a little bit, I got to say. 11:30 start time here in the East for us, and I was working on first my final Underdog Pick'ems article, which went live on the site this morning, a couple days after usual throughout the season, but it's up there and still got 13 highlighted plays for this shorter slate. And then we've got round 2 of the FFPC playoff challenge. So I was thinking through that, working on an article that I'm going to be posting this afternoon on that as well. Some different things to think about there. And then, all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, there's a DFS slate with some teams still involved here.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, but this kind of feels like the last week of fantasy football of the year to me. Like, next week with only 2 games and you can play Showdown. I'm not a huge fan because I suck at it, honestly. I'm going to probably play too much DFS and too much Underdog Battle Royale this week just because, it's the last time I can do it for 8 months or whatever.
Yep. I'll be doing Battle Royale. We'll be doing a show on that a little bit after this one. And I think it's, the last time that there's really something that you can call a slate beyond Showdowns, as you mentioned, for next week. We do have 4 teams, so there will be some games that, some formats that incorporate both of those games, all 4 teams. But, that's as short a multi-game slate as you can get, obviously. So this time we do have 4 games left. We have 8 teams. We're going to go position by position. We've got both DraftKings and FanDuel together in this one because it is a shorter slate. We're playing mostly tournaments. And even if you're playing a cash game, it's a little bit more of a tournament setup than it is a usual cash game. But we'll start with quarterbacks like usual. And I think, Jared, even with only 8 teams left, it's pretty interesting at quarterback because, you could make a case for any quarterback really on the slate to be in lineups.
You could. I think both DraftKings and FanDuel did a pretty nice job with the pricing to put all these guys in play. I'm mostly focused on the elite guys, Mahomes and Allen especially. You can obviously make a case for Jalen Hurts. I just think with only 8 quarterbacks and those 3 guys who have been so dominant throughout the season, putting up these 30-plus point games, to me, there's a pretty good chance that one of those guys is going to be the guy you need to win tournaments. So for me, it's Mahomes and Allen, the guys I'm leaning most towards at this point. And we all know about Andy Reid's record coming off bye weeks. He's been awesome. He's 28-5 in his career coming off bye weeks, including in the playoffs. Chiefs at home for a bad Jags defense. I don't see it. I'd be shocked if the Chiefs don't put up a bunch of points if Mahomes does not have a big game. So to me, Mahomes seems like the safest bet among these quarterbacks this week.
I agree with that. And if you look in our lineup generator, you'll see that he leads DK dollars per point, even as the most expensive quarterback on DraftKings this week. On FanDuel, it's Josh Allen. The big difference between the two of them there, because they're pretty close together in our QB rankings and projections, the big difference is the 3-point boost for a 300-yard bonus on DraftKings. Mahomes would get that. We have him projected over 300 passing yards. I think the only way that he lets you down this week is if Kansas City controls this game to the point that they're, running it more than they usually do. I don't think that that's something you worry about, but on the shorter slate, it's something you consider. And I do think that Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes stick out as the 2 top plays. I think Jalen Hurts is there. I think the limitation with him is the shoulder and wondering whether the team holds back a little bit. There's also some potential for that game to be lopsided. I mean, the only time that they met with both teams trying to win this year, it was completely one-sided for the Eagles. So if things went that way, I could certainly see the Eagles pulling back on Jalen Hurts a little bit, even if his shoulder is good to go now. He's not on the injury report this week, so we're not really overly concerned. But again, if the game gets to be one-sided like that, it would certainly make sense for the Eagles to protect him some. I still think that there is, all you have to do is look back at last week for the case for playing another quarterback, because I think most folks are going to be favoring Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes. Last week, we got huge points from Trevor Lawrence in a game where he threw 4 interceptions in the first half. We got huge points from Dak Prescott. We got big points from Daniel Jones. So all these guys are capable of scoring. And I mean, on this shorter slate, there are only so many ways you can get different. So I like Josh Allen. I like Patrick Mahomes, but I also think that it's a week to, play around some, especially if you're entering more lineups.
Yeah, I think if I'm not going with one of the elites, I guess I want to talk about Joe Burrow because, we have his ownership right now projected at 3%. Now, I think it'll be a bit higher than that, but I think most people are either going to go up to the Mahomes, Allen, Hurts tier, or say I'm going to go cheap at quarterback and play, a Daniel Jones or a Brock Purdy. Burrow's kind of sandwiched there at 6,500 on DraftKings. He is 8,000 on FanDuel. And honestly, like there's nothing I can point to in his situation that makes him a good play. Right? I mean, the Bills are a tough defense. Burrow's going to be likely missing 3 of his O linemen on Sunday. So, but I mean, it's Joe Burrow with 2 of the best wide receivers in the NFL, priced pretty nice, 6,500 on DraftKings, and if he's going to be even 10% owned, I think there's a case to be made to play Joe Burrow.
Yeah, I think the case for him is that ownership level. I think Trevor Lawrence is similar in that if they're going to be competitive with the Chiefs, then he's going to be involved. If they fall way behind the Chiefs, then he's going to be throwing even more and have some upside there. So I think there's nice upside. Daniel Jones is one guy I want to highlight. The Eagles went 12 games this season without allowing a quarterback to reach 20 fantasy points. And then 4 of the past 5 they faced got there. That included 21.1 for Daniel Jones in week 14. It also included 22.5 for Davis Webb in week 18. Now, obviously, as a total game, we're throwing that game out, but the Eagles were still playing most of their guys. They were missing Josh Sweat to injury, but they were trying to win that game and still let Davis Webb score some points. Each of those guys threw for less than 170 yards in those games, but each also ran for a touchdown. And that's been an area in which the Eagles have been vulnerable against quarterbacks. They've allowed the 4th most QB rushing yards on the season, just the 17th most QB rushing attempts.
Yeah, and you have Daniel Jones coming off back-to-back games of 30-plus DraftKings points. He had 25 DraftKings points the game before that. He's still cheap. Like there's a great case to be made for Daniel Jones. And you look at our lineup generator, he's our second best value on DraftKings. So case to be made. I also think he's going to be pretty popular, and I'm just going to take a stand this week and say I'm not going to play Daniel Jones. I think that the hot streak comes to an end. I'm playing this week as if the Chiefs are going to blow out the Jags. The Jags could put up some points, but I think that the Chiefs win easily, and I think the Eagles win easily. And I would not be surprised if the Giants offense doesn't put up many points in this game. So I'm generally fading the Giants offense this weekend.
Well, that brings us to running back, where there's a pretty significant Giant involved. What do you think of this running back slate?
Yeah, I'm gonna fade Saquon. If I pay up at running back, it's going to be for Christian McCaffrey. It's interesting, Saquon obviously didn't play in the Week 18 game against the Eagles, and then he was limited. That was the game he played only like 35% of the snaps in the Week 14 game against the Eagles because of the neck injury. So we haven't seen full strength Saquon against Philly this season. But the Eagles' run defense from Week 13 to Week 17, again omitting that Week 18 game when they rested starters, 3rd in Football Outsiders run defense DVOA over that stretch, up from 25th over the first 12 weeks of the season. So they got Jordan Davis back healthy. They added some veterans on the D line, and it's really helped. So I think this is a tough matchup for Saquon. I think he's going to have to do it in the passing game, which he could do obviously. But again, I'm going to take my chances and hope he only goes for 15 or 18 points, and at that point he'd be a good fade.
Yeah, I mean, did it last week receiving, only had 9 carries in that game against the Vikings. So we certainly know that he's able to do it that way. But I think it's a sensible fade, relatively speaking. Obviously, if you're playing a bunch of tournament lineups, then I wouldn't go full fade on Saquon Barkley. But I think it's okay to say partial fade. I think similar for Christian McCaffrey, though. Now, last week, I said something. It wasn't on this show because we were on Twitter Spaces. So if you were there, I said something about Christian McCaffrey getting the ball less when Elijah Mitchell is on the field. And that was the case. He only had 17 opportunities in that game against Seattle versus 12 for Elijah Mitchell. He actually trailed Elijah Mitchell by 1 target in that game, which is odd comparing these two players. Went for 136 total yards and a touchdown. That's the downside risk. If you fade Christian McCaffrey, he could touch the ball 15 times and add a couple of big plays and score twice and make you pay for it. But he had a 68-yard run in that game that accounted for 50% of his total yards. He had 4.25 yards per touch otherwise. So outside of that one big play, McCaffrey kind of showed the downside risk. And again, part of that is the high salary here, the likelihood that he's the most popular running back this week. So factoring all of that in, I think he's still a slight fade for me. Not somebody I'm getting away from completely, but at this point when it's more difficult to get different from other lineups, he's somebody I'm okay taking less of this week.
Yeah, I think especially the Elijah Mitchell near the goal line thing is a concern for me. Like I still think that the Seahawks Niners game was pretty much over by the fourth quarter, and I think Elijah Mitchell got a bit of his work then. I still think there's a chance that we get a 25 to 25, 25-ish touch game from McCaffrey if they get into a close playoff game here, which I do think this one against Dallas will be close. But the goal line stuff is concerning to me. The issue for me is if you're fading McCaffrey and Barkley, like say even just in one lineup, like who else are you playing at running back? There's some interesting guys, but there's no one else I feel great about.
I mean, it's tough to feel great, but Miles Sanders is one that pops to me. He doesn't pop by our numbers on either FanDuel or DraftKings this week, but the matchup's there. We all know that one. Giants 32nd in run defense DVOA for the season, 17th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. Gave up the huge numbers to Miles Sanders in that full meeting that they had back in week 14. Now, the issue with Miles Sanders is how much he has played in recent weeks. That might still be an issue. If he gets 11 carries in this game, he's a bad play. But he's off the injury report this week. He was listed both week 17 and week 18 with that knee issue that he did play through. Those two games were his smallest snap shares of the entire season. So I think that the knee played a role in that. We'll see this week how much of a role, but I think there's at least the potential that we get more Miles Sanders carries in this game. Favorable matchup. And again, if they do jump out to a lead, maybe even lean further on that running game and pull back a little bit from Jalen Hurts. So I think if you look at his salary, if you look at projected ownership, and if you look at the upside of the matchup, I very much like Miles Sanders across sites here.
Yeah, and he's not on this week's injury report, which is nice to see. I think he's a good tournament play. I think there's a chance that we get similar usage to what we saw the last couple games, and he only gets 10 carries, and he kills you. But the upside, that 30-point upside is there. He's shown it a few times this season, including, like you said, in that week 14 game against the Giants. So I'm going to be mixing in Sanders into my lineups. I'm going to play some Jerick McKinnon too on DraftKings. I mean, the guy's obviously on a unsustainable heater as far as touchdown scoring goes, but last year it was during the playoffs last year that McKinnon emerged for this Chiefs backfield. 11 carries and 50 rushing yards per game in 3 playoff games last year, 5.7 targets, 4.7 catches, 55 receiving yards. And McKinnon at that point hadn't done nearly as much as he's done, this year heading into the playoffs. We also have Isaiah Pacheco, who his role kind of seems to be heading in the opposite direction. Just 17 total carries over the last 2 games for Pacheco, 45% of the snaps, and then 36% of the snaps in the season finale. So again, and we have Clyde Edwards-Helaire still out this week too, it looks like. So I wouldn't be surprised if McKinnon continues to dominate passing game work in this Chiefs backfield, but if he also, gets to like 8 to 12 carries in this game. And of course, the matchup against Jacksonville's really good. The Jags actually have been decent against the run, but they've allowed the 3rd most running back catches and the 4th most running back receiving yards this season. So I think it's a particularly good matchup for McKinnon in the passing game.
Yeah, and we can all look at McKinnon and say over the longer term, somebody is not likely to keep scoring at that rate. But in the shorter term, he's been getting those touches for a team that scores a lot and throws a lot near the goal line. And as you mentioned, Pacheco has become a bit less of a factor in recent games. So, in these one-off things where you're just trying to win that week and move on, it's definitely makes more sense than it would in full season fantasy to keep riding whatever they're doing with Jerick McKinnon right now.
For sure.
On to wide receiver, where salary might make a bigger difference here than it does at any of the other positions, and especially on DraftKings. But if you look at the FanDuel lineup generator page for, both slates, we've got Jamar Chase, Stephon Diggs, Deebo Samuel atop the dollars per point. We've got T. Higgins, CeeDee Lamb joining them at the sub $600 level if you're talking about dollars per projected point. On DK, though, very different group up top. Richie James, Zay Jones, Juju, those guys are ahead of Jamar Chase, Deebo, T. Higgins. Then we've got right behind them, Darius Slayton, Brandon Ayuk, Gabe Davis, Michael Gallup, Tyler Boyd. So, Jared, for me, the takeaway here is to pay a little bit less attention to those dollars per point and chase upside over value this week.
For sure, yeah. And again, I think to me, the quarterback you're playing is going to dictate, at least one, if not more, of the wide receivers are playing. So you start there, and you can make a good case, obviously, for all the elite guys: Jamar Chase, Steph Diggs, both of the Eagles wide receivers. CeeDee Lamb is in a maybe a sneaky good spot. Maybe it's not so sneaky. You go on to DraftKings and you see the Niners as the 28th ranked defense against wide receivers. So everyone will see that it's actually a pretty good matchup for Lamb. But he was kind of quiet last week. Maybe he goes a bit overlooked this week. But some of the mid-priced and low-priced guys I like. I mean, T. Higgins to me on DraftKings, $5,800. That's just disrespectful. I'm going to play a lot of him and just hope he shows DK what's up, and then he's not a $5,800 wide receiver. I know he's been quiet the past couple of weeks, and really even looking over the past like 6 or 7 games, Jamar Chase has kind of emerged as the clear top guy in this wide receiver core. But again, like you said, in a one game sample, there's a chance T. Higgins is the guy for the Bengals. He had again, quiet the last 2 games, but 29.8 DraftKings points. The game before that was the Patriots game. He has 4 total games this season of 26 plus DK points. So he has the upside. And again, I just think he's way too cheap. He has the same upside as those elite wide receivers that are priced, in the 7Ks on DraftKings.
I'm not sure what to expect from Deebo Samuel's rostered rate this week. A team high 9 targets last week, 6 catches, 133 and a touchdown. So he's not going to sneak up on anybody. He's not going to go overlooked. Also had 32 yards rushing, but we also had a big game for Christian McCaffrey. I think he'll still be the most popular running back. I think that will affect the ownership for Deebo. It's a different slate, so I think people will be more willing to play both of them together than in a normal DFS week, but I still think it'll affect them some. George Kittle's out there, Brandon Ayuk, a potential differentiating type pick. And it's a loaded stable just in general at wide receivers, even outside of the 49ers. So it's easier to get away from Deebo Samuel this week. This game that you already mentioned for CeeDee Lamb, though, if you look at our adjusted fantasy points allowed, this game has the 2 best wide receiver scoring matchups by adjusted fantasy points allowed remaining in the league right now. The team's still playing. So I really like the Deebo CeeDee Lamb game stack here. I don't think you need to play either quarterback for that one to make sense. Most weeks you would want to play some of both quarterbacks with that, but you can play those 2 guys on this particular slate. You can play them with like a Daniel Jones, Isaiah Hodgins, or Richie James stack. Miles Sanders, you can get some savings. You can get some differentiation there. And then you can fill around that with even some more popular guys, some more expensive guys to, just fill out your lineup.
Yeah, I love the Lamb Deebo idea. Deebo, by the way, so he's only played 2 full games with Brock Purdy. He has 10 and 9 targets in those 2 games, 27% target share in the first one, 30% target share last week. Also got the 3 carries last week. So, even with the McCaffrey addition, they're still looking to get Deebo the ball on the ground. So then Dallas 26 in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers, and a lot of that's come lately as they've dealt with all these injuries in the secondary. So I agree, Deebo and Lamb both have excellent matchups this week.
3 carries for Deebo is pretty noteworthy, with not only McCaffrey in there, but also Elijah Mitchell around and healthy for that game. And Elijah Mitchell was involved in the first half. He might have gotten more later, but he was on the field in that span as well. So clearly San Francisco is back to getting the ball to a healthier Deebo. Anything else you want to highlight at wide receiver?
Let's talk Richie James. He's my guy this week, especially on DraftKings at $3,900. I mean, I do think on these short slates where ownership condenses, like, you do need to find like the one low owned guy, ideally for cheap, that doesn't even go off. But if we can get 15 points out of Richie James, like, I think that's going to be really helpful in tournaments. So we've been attacking the Eagles slot receiver defense all season. They're 31st in adjusted points allowed to slot receivers, and their starting slot corner Avonte Maddox is out. And it's really been when Maddox has been out that they've been getting gashed for the most part by these slot receivers. Richie James is the Giants' primary slot receiver. Quiet last week as his route rate was down. Slayton and Hodgins had bigger games than James, but he had been close to a full-time player for the month or 2 prior to that. He went for 19.1 DraftKings points against the Eagles back in week 14. He also has, he went for 17 DK points in week 16, 20.6 DK points in week 17. So, he had been, it kind of been James and Hodgins as the top 2 Giants receivers heading into the playoffs. Again, Hodgins did it last week, James didn't. But to me, in this matchup, I like James better, relatively speaking, considering he's cheaper, and I think he's going to be much lower owned than Hodgins is.
Yeah, I think he'll definitely have those two factors working in his favor here. My only concern is if the Giants play things the same way they did last week. We're talking about James running a route on 63% of dropbacks versus Isaiah Hodgins on 100%. So uh, if I get in there and that salary matters, if I
Yeah.
can't fit Hodgins with whatever else I'm doing, then I think James is a pretty easy choice over him. Otherwise, I like the upside on Hodgins. I think Hodgins will be higher owned. I don't think he's going to get too highly owned for that to really take him out of my lineup. And with James playing less last week, we got Hodgins running 41% of his routes from the slot, which, as you mentioned, is a good place to attack Philly.
Yeah, Hodges is $1,000 more expensive on DK, $800 more expensive on FanDuel. So they're not close anymore at this point. So again, that's why I think that the $1,000 savings on DK is definitely worth it to get down to James.
Yeah, like if I get there though, and that $1,000 doesn't matter,
Sure.
I think Hodgins is at least as high and probably a higher ceiling guy.
Yeah, I'd lean Hodgins on FanDuel, where touchdowns do matter more. I do think Hodgins is the better touchdown bet, and again, the pricing gap is actually smaller between them on FanDuel than it is on DraftKings.
And it seems like we're both easily going with one of those two guys over Darius Slayton, right?
Yes, I am.
The huge difference there is Darius Slayton works downfield, and that's going to be the toughest area for the Giants to beat these Eagles. Hodgins also, him versus James, the ADOT is about 3 yards deeper, both over the course of the season and last week. So there's just a little bit more of the physical upside there.
Yeah, you said it exactly. Outside and deep is not where you want to attack the Eagles defense. That's Slayton. Over the middle, short, which is mostly James, and Hodgins does a lot of that too. Though that's where you attack this pass defense.
Tight end, Jared. Evan Ingram stands as fairly easily the top value, I think. And you look at it's not just about value. Like I said earlier, you're chasing upside over value, but he doesn't lose anything on upside. So the case for him, game conditions favoring passing volume for Jacksonville here. They are the biggest underdogs on the slate. It's the highest game total by the Vegas numbers right now. The Chiefs are soft on defense, and they're actually softer against the pass than the run at this point by the numbers. And we saw last week where Evan Ingram got opportunities and delivered against a defense that is tougher than the one that they're facing this week, especially against tight ends.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the only argument against Ingram is this is actually a pretty loaded tight end slate, considering we only have 8 teams. I mean, we obviously have Travis Kelce against Jacksonville, who Football Outsider says is the worst tight end defense in their DVOA. Kelce went for 81 yards and a score against them back in week 10. So, he's obviously an elite play. I like Dallas Goedert a lot this week too. And we talked about it last week with TJ Hockenson. It's a bad Giants tight end defense. They've given up 2 big games to Hockenson over the last month or so. They gave up 2 TDs to Dalton Schultz over that span. Goddard went 6 catches, 46 yards on 7 targets against the Giants back in Week 18. So not a slate breaker, but again, he has the upside to do what Hockenson has done against this defense over the past few games. So $4,500 for Goddard on DraftKings. He's actually my favorite play at tight end this week. I think he's going to come in a bit lower owned than Evan Ingram, but I'll be curious to see how those ownership projections end up settling.
I think the shorter slate also makes it very viable to play 2 tight ends here. Yeah. And there are all of those guys are attractive. I agree. And that's definitely going to be in my rundown for the draft show that we're doing in a little bit.
Yep. Agreed.
Over to defense. For me, there's no truly good play this week. So I think I probably lean toward the Bengals as the top option. They're nice and cheap. And the Dolphins were the top scoring fantasy defense last week against the Bills. 7 sacks, 3 takeaways, a defensive touchdown obviously helped power that. But we've seen the Bills, even when they score a lot of points, are capable of being quite sloppy.
Yes, I think the Bengals are the cheap D to play. I definitely prefer them over the Jags and the Giants, who are also down there. I like the Bills on the other side of that game, again, because the Bengals are missing those 3 O linemen, or likely missing those 3 O linemen. We know La'el Collins is definitely out. I think Jonah Williams and Alex Kappa are going to be out too. And plus, too, the Bengals are going to chuck it regardless. I mean, they've been the pass heaviest offense in the NFL, looking at pass rate over expected for the past month or two now, and I think that's going to continue. So just sack opportunities, interception opportunities. So I think Buffalo's interesting, and then I like Dallas too. Man, this Brock Purdy run has to end at some point. He didn't even play well last week. He missed throws, but the Shanahan scheme and the weapons it doesn't matter. But at some point, I think it's going to matter. And two, so these are the defenses that Purdy has faced. He came in for Garoppolo in the game against Miami. Then it was Tampa, who, has some talent. Then Seattle, Washington, Vegas, Arizona, and Seattle again. To me, this Dallas defense is definitely the best pass rush he's going to have faced. I know we talked about the secondary having some issues, but easily the best pass rush he's going to face. So I don't know, maybe 7th round rookie Brock Purdy will show himself on Saturday or Sunday.
Jared Smola slinging the Brock Purdy haterade on this divisional round Friday.
Someone's got to do it. Someone's got to do it.
I certainly think, like I said, there's no truly good play this week. And the way that he scored fantasy points last week, he being Brock Purdy, is certainly not going to encourage anybody to play the defense against him. So I agree that there is a case for playing that Dallas defense, likely to be lower owned with some upside, because we are still talking about a rookie quarterback. Like, even if you're very good, one hiccup is bound to come at some point.
Yeah, you think.
Unless you're Brock Purdy. That's going to do it for this divisional round DFS podcast, which will actually be our last DFS pod for the season. Jared and I will be back on the YouTube channel in a little bit to do our final draft show. As we mentioned, the slate's coming down to next week. It'll just be 4 teams and then 2 weeks till the Super Bowl after that. But we are going to have more shows. We're going to be jumping into the dynasty stuff starting next week. And then, before we know it, Jared, it's going to be rookie scouting time. It's going to be NFL draft time. We're going to be moving into next season. We're going to have projections for 2023 before too long. So the season never really ends, right?
No rest for us. No rest for you. No rest for me. It's football all the time.
Just phases. All right. For Jared Small and the rest of the Draft Sharks crew, I'm Matt Schauf saying thanks so much for swimming with us.